Hello, welcome to the Nutmeg by the Evening Standard, where we get together and talk about the big issues in football and the matches we've been to this weekend. I'm Dan Kilpatrick. I'm joined by Jack Rosser, Simon Collings and James Robson to discuss the London football we've watched. We'll start with Spurs. I was there at White Hart Lane yesterday for their 2-0 win over West Brom, Jose Mourinho's side, relieving the pressure on their manager somewhat and ending a run of 3 straight defeats, with Harry Kane starring and inevitably raising questions about whether Spurs are the Harry Kane team. Again, he scored the first goal and was heavily involved in the second for Heung-min Son. Jack, obviously, Harry Kane's a fantastic player, and I think any side would be improved by him, and I think any side would miss him when he was gone. But is there a problem to Spurs being that reliant on one man?
It's difficult to say, isn't it? Because I don't think it's a terrible thing to be reliant on someone who is arguably the best striker in Europe. It sort of always boils down to him and Lewandowski, doesn't it? So I don't think it's a crisis to be so over-reliant on one player, but it does raise questions over whether you can afford to rest him when you need to, because obviously he's had ankle injuries and problems from season after season now. And Pochettino and Mourinho, and to an extent Gareth Southgate, have all had issues with giving him the right amount of rest, or when he declares himself fit, introducing him in slowly. He's not someone that's ever been eased back in with sort of 10, 15 minutes back off the bench, as he was thrown straight in yesterday. And it does present problems when you go forward, because you never get the chance to give anyone else a go in that position. So, you can rely on Harry Kane because of just how good he is and how transformative he is to when he plays. But there are some challenges when you need to play without him, because you never really get to see how that works.
Yeah, I think part of the problem with Kane is that he wants to play every minute of every game. He's got this insatiable desire for personal accolades and obviously team accolades as well, which is what drives him on. And he wants to be scoring goals. He wants to be playing every possible minute. And I think the problem Spurs have found this season, which is a problem that, as you said, predates Mourinho and goes back to Pochettino, is that when he does inevitably get injured, and he tends to get at least kind of one ankle injury now per season, and Spurs are relatively lucky that this time it wasn't a serious one. When he does get injured, Vinicius, Gareth Bale just haven't played enough to kind of step into the side. And then arguably there's a lack of attacking structure or system under Mourinho and a pattern of play that his deputies can really step into. So Spurs really did miss him. James, what's your take on that?
Well, I don't think specifically a Spurs or Harry Kane issue. It's obviously emphasised because Kane is such a fantastic player, as Jack said, arguably the best striker in Europe or the world. But it's more of a modern day football issue, because most clubs now play with one centre forward. I remember talking to an agent a while back about this, and he was trying to get a player into a Premier League club, and he was saying, well, the problem is no striker wants to join, because they knew who the centre forward was, and if he was fit, he played, because you generally play with one centre forward now, don't you? And there aren't that many teams that have got the luxury of having a whole load that you swap in and out. When they're in form, they play all the time, and that tends to be it. I suppose if you look at someone like Manchester United now, where they've got Cavani and Martial as the centre forwards, really Cavani's playing a lot because Martial isn't playing very well. That's the issue. If the one's playing and scoring, they tend to play all the time. It's almost like it used to be with goalkeepers in the past. It's a pretty thankless task to be the second choice striker when you play with one up top.
Yeah, I think that actually raises an interesting issue that I was getting at there with Mourinho, which is that so much of his success has been really based on having fantastic players in the final third and kind of relying on them for individual inspiration to make something happen. And he doesn't have these systems and these patterns that the likes of Guardiola and Klopp employ, and that make it easier for players to step in and deputise when there's squad rotation. I think with the amount of games in modern football, but particularly this season with the condensed league and the relentlessness of the schedule, Spurs have really suffered for not having those kind of systems in place, and there's been over-reliance on Kane, and when he's dropped out, they just look totally clueless in that defeat to Chelsea that you and I both watched. And I think it suggests that Spurs really need Kane, but they also need to build something a bit more coherent around Kane as well. It can't just be hoping he's going to pull something out of the bag every week. I feel like that's their biggest problem. And to that end, we're going to move on to some questions. And I've got a question from Alex Cali on Twitter who says, how sincere are you finding this Jose Mourinho and Dele Alli chat? I think it's clear Mourinho will move to a 4-2-3-1 with Ndombele deeper, but is this Dele talk a cheap way to relieve some fan and Daniel Levy, that is, pressure? Now, this is Mourinho's claim that now that Ndombele's fitter, he's going to move him to the base of midfield, which opens up the number 10 role for perhaps Dele Alli or Giovanni Lo Celso. And we saw evidence of that yesterday against West Brom with Ndombele playing deeper and Lamela and Lucas coming in to the front line. And it did work, albeit West Brom looked like a really, really poor side to me. So I don't think we can draw too many conclusions. I mean, personally, to answer the question, I think Mourinho is sincere. I think he sees this as a way to get another attacker into the side and to perhaps get more out of Ndombele. But has he been forced into that position by the fact that the club simply wouldn't allow Dele to leave? I think probably yes. I think if it was just down to Mourinho, he would have probably sent him on loan to PSG in January and put him out of the way. As it is, he's still at Spurs, and Mourinho now, I think, feels under some pressure to use him, much in the same way that he did with Ndombele, albeit very, very successfully since at the start of the summer. Let's move on to some other questions. We've got one for you, Simon, on Arsenal from Ard Football on Twitter, who says, why didn't we sign a left-back considering Tierney's long list of injuries?
Yeah, I think, to be honest with Arsenal, I think left-back was in a way the next sort of cab off the rank, or the next deal they would have looked to have done if they could have done another deal. I think we've got to give some credit to Edu and Arteta for the business they did. I think given the climate, and we saw, spending was down and the market was very quiet because of COVID, Arsenal did do a lot of business, particularly getting players out of the club. They trimmed the squad down, and then it was about getting the few players in that they wanted, and they really wanted to get a creative midfielder in. They obviously got Martin Odegaard, and they decided they had to get an experienced goalkeeper in, and they got Matt Ryan in. And I think left back was the next one they would have done, but part of the issue was there was no space in the squad, so all the non-homegrown slots were gone, which is why the names of Bertrand and Van Aanholt came to light, because they're two players who are homegrown. But they're deals that couldn't really get done now. I think Southampton, as Jack will be able to tell us, were pretty sure that they weren't going to let Bertrand go this month. He's got 6 months on his deal, but with no chance of them getting a left back, they'd have rather let him go for free than sold him to Arsenal. And so I think in the end, the club took the decision that it's one they're going to do in the summer. And also the performances of Cedric Suarez made that decision a bit easier. I'll admit I was a bit like everyone else. I wasn't really convinced when Arsenal signed him, particularly after his first few performances, but he's actually filled in really well at left back. And I think it was basically taking the decision that we can get through the next 3-4 months with Cedric covering and then do it properly in the summer, rather than rushing something and getting in a player who you don't really want.
We will come on to Arsenal in more detail later. They slipped to a 1-0 defeat to Aston Villa this weekend. Jack, West Ham also frustrated this weekend, and questions over Mikel Antonio's fitness. It feels like so much of their season kind of relying on his hamstrings, which we have talked about before. They've only got one recognised striker now, of course, after selling Sebastian Haller in January. Is Antonio fit for the Manchester United Cup game tomorrow? And do you feel that West Ham's hopes of continuing this really promising season depend solely on him?
Effectively, yes. I mean, they've signed well. Jesse Lingard made a real impact and showed it when he came into the side at Aston Villa. But that happens with Antonio leading the line. He's not injured, he's not unfit, but he was running on empty at Fulham at the weekend. And Moyes has said this morning that he's going to wait and see how he is today in training and then give him an assessment before the game tomorrow. But I think Moyes has always known that one of these games from Villa, Fulham and Man United, he's going to have to give Antonio a rest. And it was just picking which one he was going to do it in. But you saw from how tired he was against Fulham, the runs he makes and the way he uses his strength and pace against defenders to open up pockets behind him, allow people like Jesse Lingard, Said Benrahma the space to go and put in the performances they have been recently. And when he hasn't got the energy to do that, everything's a bit more congested, and West Ham really struggle to create things. So it's going to be a test of the risk Moyes chose to take when deciding not to spend the money to sign a striker. It wasn't that they didn't have the funds. He just didn't want to. He's aware that he's not got an endless pot of money to spend, so he doesn't want to be wasting it. So this is a test of what he can do to replicate Antonio, whether it's Yarmolenko through the middle. Ben Rama could play there. It's going to be interesting to see how they get on if he decides Antonio needs that rest tomorrow.
Yeah, and perhaps an interesting example of what James was talking about earlier, in that if I was a budding striker hoping to come to the Premier League, I wouldn't be that interested in joining West Ham, where Antonio is such a presence and is guaranteed to be first choice when he's fit. Although West Ham's record of signing strikers is famously abysmal, isn't it? But they've got to do something there in the summer. James, we'll come on to Chelsea, who continued their great start under Thomas Tuchel in a bit more detail very shortly. But in terms of readers' questions, we've got one asking if it's too early to judge Tuchel given the level of opposition he's played. Obviously, they beat bottom club Sheffield United yesterday. They have played Spurs, but I think we can both agree it was a pretty abject Spurs at perhaps their lowest point of the season. So do you think that's fair? Is it too early to draw many conclusions from what Tuchel's done so far?
Well, I think when it comes to him, you judge him on what he's done elsewhere. That's why Chelsea appointed him. They think they've got one of the best managers in the world, and I think his record stands up to that. And Abramovich wanted he didn't want to write off this season at this point. So he wanted someone who could come in and make an immediate impact. And I think the test that he's had, the biggest test he's had, is that he's played against 4 teams really who offered little to no ambition. To be fair, Sheffield United had a couple of moments yesterday, but generally he's been really tested by the fact that he's played against sides who've sat so deep that it's been really difficult to create anything, and they have struggled to create. That would be the one big, I suppose, negative you would say about his start so far. But he's come in, won 3 games, drew another. I think it was a last-minute goal line clearance that stopped him from winning that one against Wolves. He's answered pretty much every question asked of him so far. So I think you can draw the conclusion that he was wanted to come in and make an immediate impact, and he's done precisely that. They're now right on the verge of top 4, and who knows what else they can get. I don't know whether in these 4 games we would have seen the same under Lampard. Where would Chelsea be now if he'd still been in charge? And I'm not saying I advocated him getting the sack in terms of a longer, broader, the wider picture, but in terms of saving this season, well, Tuchel is. It's been a bright start in that sense.
You said Chelsea struggled to create, or have struggled to create, but did you see green shoots of promise for Timo Werner against the Blades? And how do you think Olivier Giroud did? Do you think he'll have convinced Tuchel that he should be the man leading the line?
Giroud was pretty anonymous, I've got to say. A bit like Abraham the other week, and a bit like Giroud before that as well. That type of striker leading the line does not seem to suit this Tuchel system. Again, that might be just about the opposition they've played against, because they've certainly not been lumping the ball into the box, have they? That's not working at the moment. In terms of Werner, at least Tuchel's trying to find ways to get the best out of him. You can definitely see his confidence is growing, because he's now won 2 penalties in the space of 2 games. He set up Mason Mount's goal. There were some good runs, but he doesn't really look like scoring a goal. That's the problem. That's what they bought him for. He's a striker, £45 million striker, they thought one of the best in Europe. I think you would have been hoping he would be getting 25 to 30 goals this season. And what is it now? I think that was an 18th game this run's been going on for now. I think it's 1 goal in 18 games. That's not good enough. And I've got to say, he still doesn't look like scoring. It was interesting, actually, I just want to say, when he was interviewed about penalties and said, when do you think you'll be back on penalty duty? And he didn't sound like a man who wanted to take them anytime soon. He said, well, you saw the one against Luton. Maybe I shouldn't be taking them at the moment. Now, I can't imagine Alan Shearer saying that. It would just never happen, would it? Strikers, it's any chance they can get to get the ball in the back of the net. And he's taken that a bit too comfortably, I think, than you'd want from a supposedly hungry striker. So he's still some way off, I think.
Well, Collins has already got the obligatory Southampton mentioning, but Ralph Hasenhüttl managed Timo Werner while he was in Germany. And he was asked about how to get the best out of him a couple of weeks ago, and said you effectively have to build the entire team around him and tune everyone to what he needs to get the best out of him. Given how much Chelsea have spent, is that worth doing just to get the best out of him, do you think?
Well, one of the things I was told when they signed him, because remember, there were a lot of teams who wanted him. Manchester United were interested. He was heavily linked with Real Madrid. I don't know if they had any money in the end, but there were a lot of teams around Liverpool as well, of course. A lot of teams around Europe who wanted him. And one of the big things Chelsea said to him was that they were going to make him their star man, their new Hazard, if you like. So I think that was a plan when he came in. Of course, things have changed. You've got to remember at the start, he was flying as well, wasn't he? I think he was a bit unfortunate with the other injuries Chelsea had, because he suddenly started being moved around. So he never really had a chance to go with that, what we thought was the forward line to take them into the future, Pulisic and Ziyech on either side of him, because they were injured so frequently. We've not really had a chance to see him settled in one position. I think, you spend that money on him, then you build around him. But I also think it's interesting, Chelsea's interest in Haaland as well, because then you start thinking, well, okay, where does he fit into that?
It's worth saying, I suppose, that the fact that Chelsea seems so determined to appoint a German coach, and there were links with Rangnick as well before Tuchel came in, does kind of suggest that they are committed to making him a big part of their future, and that they're not, they're certainly not thinking, this isn't a transfer that's worked out. They're very much thinking, we need to get the best out of this guy. Does that seem fair?
Well, I mean, it can't just be the German factor, can it? If it is, you can find a bunch of A-level students who can speak German. It can't be just down to that, surely.
Well, the fact that the two of their most high-profile signings in the summer are German and struggling, I don't think it was a coincidence from what I read, but I may be wrong.
No, well, look, that was certainly before Lampard even went. That was the word going around, that they were looking for a German-speaking coach. I suspect that it was more a case of the outstanding candidates happened to be German, i.e. Tuchel, Nagelsmann. I think that would be more the fact. For instance, if there was a Catalan coach who was available, I don't think they'd be turning him down. If I don't think it's just about the passport and being able to speak the language. Also, that would, you then say, well, what about all the English lot and Spaniards and what else have you? I think it's such a multicultural game now. I'd find that I would find it surprising if Tuchel got the job just because of his passport. I think it's his record, and maybe the fact that he's worked with top class players like Neymar and Kylian Mbappe, and maybe that would be more of a reason in terms of them hoping he could get the best out of the likes of Havertz and.
Fair enough. It may just be a thing that is said when a manager comes in. It was before I started covering Spurs, but there was definitely suggestions that Pochettino's appointment was to get the best out of Eric Lamela, if you can believe that, back in 2014. I mean, if Timo Werner has a career in the Premier League anything like Eric Lamela, then he's obviously consider himself a massive success. Simon, let's move on to talk about Arsenal. We've covered Kane, Antonio, Werner, Giroud. And Aubameyang is as big a name as any of them, but continues to struggle for Arsenal on the bench yesterday and quiet when he did come on against Aston Villa. Only 5 Premier League goals this season since signing his bumper new contract. We've spoken about him a lot, but how do you see the situation as it stands now?
It's an odd one with Aubameyang. I was convinced at the start of the season, I really thought he was going to be a contender for the Golden Boot and, the real talisman that he was for Arsenal last season. But it just hasn't really worked out all campaign, all season. And I think the interesting thing is we've had sort of 4 or 5 weeks on here where we've been talking about Arsenal. It's been blissfully enjoyable for them not to be the crisis club for about 5 weeks. But Aubameyang hasn't really been part of that revival. He hasn't been them sparking into life hasn't been because Aubameyang's been scoring goals. It's because of Saka, Smith Rowe, even Lacazette to an extent. So it's interesting how the team isn't what they were last season, where they were so reliant on him. Perhaps uncomfortably so. We talk about Kane, but I really think Arsenal last season, if they didn't have Aubameyang, they would not have won that FA Cup, and they would certainly not have come, in the top half of the table. They really struggled without him. But I think this season, he's just, the past few weeks, he's obviously had his personal issues going on away from the pitch. He's been away from the training ground. He's come back in here to have his negative test to link up with the group. So I think perhaps having this sort of week off now where, there's no midweek game, there's some actual time on the training ground for Arteta and for Aubameyang and for everyone to get together, I think could actually be quite helpful for him, because I think they almost need that bit of a break, him and the team. I think it just hasn't really clicked. But for me, you persevere with him. I don't think there's a case of, he's suddenly lost his legs or he's suddenly lost what made him a great player. I think he's just going through a bad spell, which for him is very rare in his career. Certainly during Dortmund and at Arsenal, he's never had a spell like this. But I think Arsenal will stick by him and trust that he'll come out the other side of it.
His goals obviously coming back would be a massive bonus, but you think it's also his experience as well. You spoke about Smith Rowe and Saka being the ones sort of leading the revival, but young players are always going to go through, dips and rises in form. It happened with Mason Mount in his first season. He was excellent at the start of the season, but because he'd been played so much, he tailed off around Christmas and then came back. Aubameyang will sort of have that experience and knowledge to manage his performances, and if he's in good form, be able to keep it going and know the positions to get into to score. I think Match of the Day picked it out over the weekend, sort of Lacazette's phobia of being inside the box when the chances were being created. Arsenal really missed someone knowing the right place to be at the right time, and if he can get back into the side and start scoring again, he'll be able to help keep everyone else's levels higher with the young players not being relied on so much.
I mean, the thing with Aubameyang, I will just say is that it's quite a weird comment to make, but he, other than scoring goals, there's not masses he really brings to the team. In the role he plays, he is an out-and-out goal-scoring forward. And when he's not scoring goals, you look at his output, and it's very different to someone like a Saka, who's a bit more creative. But when the goals come out of his game, I think with Aubameyang, you suddenly sort of question what he's putting into the side. But the key thing I think that has been is we're still seeing that work rate for him. I think he's still trying to get in the right position. Certainly before come out of the team, because of the personal reasons, he was showing signs of life and showing he was getting better. But the debate now will be whether you move him to that central striker role or whether you keep him out left. I think his match today, as Jack was saying, I think they made a good case that Lacazette doesn't always offer that threat of in the box, and Aubameyang it might be now, particularly with Nicola Pepe's form being better. You go with Pepe and Saka on the wings and play Aubameyang through the middle for the next few weeks.
Yeah, so Arsenal have the week off, of course, but Spurs, Chelsea and West Ham all in midweek FA Cup 5th round action. And we'll be back on Monday to talk over that and the Premier League games. Thanks to Jack, James and Simon, and thanks for watching. Bye for now.